Pour yourself another cup of cocoa, join me again by the tree, and listen to another 2 chapters of The Nutcracker and the Mouse King. Tonight we begin with Chapter 9, the conclusion of the story of the hard nut. The next evening, as soon as the candles were lit, Godfather Drosselmeier appeared and continued his story as follows. Drosselmeier and the astronomer had been 15 years on their journey without seeing the least signs of the Nutcracker. It would take me a month, dear listeners, to tell where they went and what strange things happened to them, and I must pass them over and commence where Drosselmeier sank at last into despondency, and felt a great desire to see his dear native city of Nuremberg. This desire came upon him all at once as he was smoking a pipe of tobacco with his friend in the middle of the great wood in Asia. "Oh, sweet city," he cried, "sweet native city, sweet Nuremberg, they who have never seen thee, though they may have traveled to London, Paris, Rome, if their heart is not dead to emotion, must continually desire to visit thee. Oh, sweet Nuremberg, sweet city where there are so many beautiful houses with beautiful windows." As Drosselmeier grieved in such a sorrowful manner, the astronomer was moved with sympathy, and began to cry and howl so pitifully that it was heard far and wide through all of Asia. He soon composed himself again, wiped the tears out of his eyes, and said, "But why, my respected colleague, why sit here and howl? Why should we not go to Nuremberg? Is it not all the same wherever we seek after this miserable Nutcracker?" "That is true," replied Drosselmeier, greatly consoled. Both arose, knocked out their pipes, and went straight forward out of the wood into the middle of Asia, right to Nuremberg. They had scarcely arrived there when Drosselmeier ran to his brother, Christopher Zacharias Drosselmeier, puppet-maker, varnisher, and gilder, whom he had not seen for these many years. The watchmaker told him the whole story of Princess Pirlipat, Lady Mouserings, and the Nutcracker, so that he struck his hands together over and over again with astonishment, and exclaimed, "Aye, aye, brother, brother, what strange things these are!" Drosselmeier then related the story of the history of his travels, how he had passed 2 years with King Date, how coldly he had been received by Prince Almond, and how he had sought information to no purpose of the Natural Society in Squirrelberg. In short, how his search everywhere had been in vain to find even the least signs of the Nutcracker. During this account, Christopher Zacharias had often snapped his fingers, turned about on one foot, winked, laughed, clucked with his tongue, and then called out, if it should, At last, he tossed his wig and hat up in the air, and clasped his brother round the neck, and cried, "Brother, brother, you are safe, safe, I say, for I must be wonderfully mistaken if I have not that Nutcracker at this very moment in my possession." He then drew a little box from his pocket, and took out of it a gilded nut of moderate size. "See," he said, "this nut fell into my hands in this way. Many years ago a stranger came here at Christmas time with a sack full of nuts, which he offered for sale at a cheap price. Just as he passed my shop, he got into a quarrel with a nut seller of this city, who did not like to see a stranger come hither to undersell him, and for this reason attacked him. The man put down his sack upon the ground, the better to defend himself, and at the same moment a heavily laden wagon passed directly over it. All the nuts were cracked into pieces, except this one. The stranger, with a singular smile, offered me this singular nut for a bright dollar of the year 1720. I thought that strange, but as I happened to find in my pocket just such a dollar as the man wanted, I bought the nut and gilded it over, without exactly knowing why I bought the nut so dear, or why I set so much store by it. All doubt whether this nut was actually the long-sought Nutcracker was instantly removed when the astronomer was called, who carefully scraped off the gold and found upon the rind the word Krakatuk engraved in Chinese characters. The joy of the travelers was beyond bounds, and the brother was the happiest man under the sun, for Drosselmeier assured him that his fortune was made, since he would have a considerable pension for the rest of his days. And then there was the gold which had been scraped off. He might keep that for his gilding. The machinist and the astronomer had both put off their nightcaps and were getting into bed as the latter commenced. "My worthy colleague, good fortune never comes single. Take my word for it. We have found not only the Nutcracker, but also the young man who is to crack it and hand the kernel to the princess. I mean nobody else than your brother's son. I cannot sleep, no, this very night I must cast the youth's horoscope." With these words he threw his nightcap off his head and began straightway to make an observation. The brother's son was, in truth, a handsome, well-grown young man who had never been shaved and never worn boots. In his early youth he had, on Christmas nights, gone around as a merry Andrew, but this could not be seen in his behavior in the least, so well had his manners been formed by his father's care. On Christmas days he wore a handsome red coat trimmed with gold, a sword, a hat under his arm, and a curling wig. In this fine dress he would stand in his father's shop, and out of gallantry crack nuts for the young girls, for which reason he was called the handsome Nutcracker. On the following morning the astronomer was in raptures. He fell upon the machinist's neck and cried, "It is he! We have him! He is found! But there are two things, worthy colleague, that we must see to. In the first place, we must braid for your excellent nephew a stout wooden queue which shall be joined in such a way to his lower jaw that it can move it with great force. In the next place, when we arrive at the king's palace, we must let no one know that we have brought the young man with us who is to crack the nut. It is best that he should not be found for a long time. I read in his horoscope that after many young men have broken their teeth to no purpose, the king will promise to him who cracks the nut and restores the princess to her lost beauty, the princess herself, and the succession to the throne as a reward." His brother, the puppet maker, was highly delighted to think that his son might marry the princess, and to become a prince and king, and he gave himself up entirely to the hands of the two travelers. The cue which Drosselmeier fastened upon the young and hopeful nephew answered admirably, so that he made a series of the most successful experiments even upon the hardest peach stones. As Drosselmeier and the astronomer had immediate information to the palace of the discovery of the Nutcracker, suitable notices had been published, and when the travelers arrived, many handsome young men, and among them some handsome princes, had appeared, who, trusting to their sound teeth, were ready to undertake the disenchantment of the princess. The travelers were not a little terrified when they beheld the princess again. Her body, with its tiny hands and feet, was hardly able to carry her great misshapen head, and the ugliness of her face was increased by a white cotton beard, which had spread itself around her mouth and over her chin. All happened as the astronomer had read in the horoscope. One youth after another bit upon the Nutcracker until his teeth and jaws were sore, and as he was led away, half swooning, by the physician in attendance, sighed out, "Ah, that was a hard nut." When the king, in the anguish of his heart, had promised his daughter and his kingdom to him who should effect the disenchantment, the handsome young Drosselmeier stepped forward and begged for permission to begin the experiment. And no one had pleased the fancy of the princess as deeply as young Drosselmeier. She laid her little hand upon her heart and sighed, "Ah, if this might be the one who is to crack the Nutcracker and become my husband." After young Drosselmeier had gracefully saluted the king and queen, and then the Princess Pirlipat, he received the Nutcracker from the hands of the master of ceremonies, and put it without hesitation between his teeth. He pulled the queue very hard, and crack! The shell broke into many pieces. He then nicely removed the little threads and broken bits of the shell that hung to the kernel, and reached it with a low bow to the princess, after which he shut his eyes and began to walk backwards. The princess straightway swallowed the kernel, and behold, her ugly shape was gone, and in its place appeared a most beautiful figure, with a face of roses and lilies, delicate white and red, eyes of living sparkling azure, and locks curling in bright gold ringlets. Drums and trumpets mingled their sounds with the loud rejoicings of the people. The king and his whole court danced, as at Pirlipat's birth, upon one leg, and the queen had to be carefully tended with cologne water because she had fallen into a swoon from delight and rapture. Young Drosselmeier, who still had 7 steps to perform, was a good deal discomposed by the tumult, but he kept firm, and was just stretching back his right foot for the 7th step, when Lady Mouserings rose, squeaking and squealing out of the floor. Down came his foot upon her head, and he stumbled so that he hardly could keep himself from falling. Alas, what a hard fate! As quick as thought, the youth was changed to the former figure of the princess. His body became shriveled up, and was hardly able to support his great misshapen head. His eyes turned green and staring, his mouth was stretched from ear to ear. Instead of his queue, a narrow wooden cloak hung down upon his back, with which he moved his lower jaw. The watchmaker and astronomer were benumbed with terror and affright, while Lady Mouserings rolled bleeding and kicking upon the floor. Her malice did not go unpunished, for young Drosselmeier had trodden upon her neck so heavily with the sharp heel of his shoe that she could not survive. When Lady Mouserings lay in her last agonies, she squeaked and whimpered in a piteous tone, "Oh, Crackatuck, hard nut, of thee I must now die. Sun with 7 crowns will bite Nutcracker at night. In revenge for his mother's death, must I, so young, oh, agony, queek." With this cry, Lady Mouserings died, and the royal oven heater carried out her body. As for young Drosselmeier, no one troubled himself any further about him, but the princess put the king in mind of his promise, and he commanded that they should bring the young hero before him. But when the unfortunate youth approached, the princess held both hands before her face and cried, "Away, away with the ugly Nutcracker." The court-martial immediately took him by the shoulders and pushed him out of doors. The king was full of anger because they had wished to give him a Nutcracker for a son-in-law, and he put all the blame upon the machinist and the astronomer. He banished them forever from the kingdom. This did not stand in the horoscope which the astronomer had set upon at Nuremberg, but he did not allow himself to be discouraged. He straightway took another observation, and declared that he could read in the stars that the young Drosselmeier would conduct himself so well in his new station, that in spite of his deformity he would yet become a prince and a king. And he declared that his former beauty would return as soon as the son of Lady Mouserings, who had been born with 7 heads after the death of her 7 sons, had fallen by his hand, and a maiden had loved him, notwithstanding his ugly shape. And though they say that young Drosselmeier had actually been seen about his Christmas time in his father's shop at Nuremberg as a Nutcracker, it is true, but at the same time, as a prince. This, children, is the story of the hard nut. And you know now why people so often say, "That was a hard nut," and whence it comes that nutcrackers are so ugly. The counselor thus concluded his narration. Maria thought that Princess Pirlipat was an ill-natured, ungrateful thing, and Fred declared that if the Nutcracker were anything of a man, he would not be long in settling matters with the Mouse King, and would get his old shape again, very soon. Chapter 10. The Uncle and Nephew. If any one of my good listeners has ever had the misfortune to cut themselves with glass, they know how much it hurts, and how long a time it takes to heal. Whenever Maria tried to get up, she felt very dizzy, and so it continued for a whole week, during which time she was obliged to remain in bed. But at last she became entirely well and could play about the chamber as merrily as ever. Everything in the glass case looked prettily, for the trees, flowers, and houses and beautiful puppets stood there as new and bright as ever. But, best of all, Maria found her dear Nutcracker again. He stood on the second shelf and smiled upon her with a good sound set of teeth. In the midst of all the pleasure which she felt in gazing at her favorite, a pang went through her heart when she thought that Godfather Drosselmeier's story had been nothing else but the history of the Nutcracker, and of his quarrel with Lady Mouserings and her son. She knew well enough that her Nutcracker could be none other than the young Drosselmeier of Nuremberg, Godfather Drosselmeier's agreeable but now, alas, enchanted nephew. For that skilful watchmaker at the court of Pirlipat's father was the Councillor Drosselmeier himself. She did not doubt that for an instant, even while he was telling the story. But why was it that your uncle did not help you? Why did he not help you? Complained Maria, as it became clearer and clearer to her mind that in the battle which she saw, Nutcracker's crown and kingdom were at stake. Were not all the other puppets subject to him? And is it not plain that the prophecy of the astronomer had been fulfilled, and that young Drosselmeier is prince and king of the puppets? While the shrewd Maria explained and arranged all of this so well in her mind, she believed, since she had seen Nutcracker and his vassals in motion, that they actually did live and move. But that was not so. Everything in the glass case remained stiff and lifeless, yet Maria, far from giving up her conviction, cast all the blame upon the magic of Lady Mouserings and her seven-headed son. But if you are not able to move or to talk to me, dear Master Drosselmeier, she said aloud to the Nutcracker, yet I know well enough that you understand me, and know what a good friend I am to you. You may depend upon my help, and I will beg of your uncle to bring his skill to your assistance, whenever you have need of it. Nutcracker remained still and motionless, but it seemed to Maria as if a gentle sigh was breathed in the glass case so that the panes trembled, scarce audibly indeed, but with a strange sweet tone, and a voice rang out like a little bell. Maria mine, I'll be thine, thou art mine, Maria mine. Maria felt in the cold shuddering that crept over her a singular pleasure. Twilight had come on. The doctor, with Godfather Drosselmeier, entered the sitting room, and it was not long before Louise had arranged the tea table and sat around talking cheerfully of various things. Maria had very quietly taken her little armchair and seated herself close at Godfather Drosselmeier's feet. During a moment when they were all silent, she looked up with her large blue eyes in the councillor's face and said, I know, dear godfather, that my Nutcracker is your nephew, the young Drosselmeier of Nuremberg, and that he has become a prince, or king rather, as your companion the astronomer foretold. All has turned out exactly so. You know now that he is at war with the son of the Lady Mouserings, and with the hateful Mouse King. Why do you not help him? Maria then related the whole course of the battle just as she had seen it, and was often interrupted by the loud laughter of her mother and Louise. Fred and Drosselmeier remained serious, however. Where does the child get all this strange stuff in her head? Asked the doctor. She has a lively imagination, replied the mother. In fact, they are nothing but dreams caused by her violent fever. That story is not true, said Fred. My red hussars are not such cowards as that. If I thought so, swords and daggers, I would make a stir among them. But Godfather Drosselmeier, with a strange smile, took little Maria upon his lap, and said in a softer tone than he was ever heard to speak, Ah, dear Maria, more power is given to thee than to me, or to the rest of us. Thou, like Pirlipat, art a princess born, for thou dost reign in a bright and beautiful kingdom. but thou hast much to suffer, if thou wouldst take the part of the poor misshapen Nutcracker, for the Mouse King watches him at every hole and corner. I cannot. Thou and thou alone canst rescue him. Be firm and true. Neither Maria nor anyone else knew what Drosselmeier meant by these words, and they appeared so singular to Dr. Stahlbaum that he felt the counselor's pulse and said, "Worthy friend, you have some violent congestion about the head. I will prescribe something for you." But the mother shook her head thoughtfully and spoke, "I feel what it is that the counselor means, but I cannot express it in words."